Hi, dear Donald Trump. I would like to congratulate you on your impressive victory in the US presidential election. You truly deserve to become president, and the overwhelming majority of Americans voted for you because you stand for peace, for the end of the bloody imperialist conflict, and advocate for the beginning of peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine with the participation of the entirely international community. This terrible war has claimed lives, according to the New York Times, more than 1 million lives on both sides, including military personnel and civilians. People are dying every day. According to the UN International Organization for Migration, the conflict has cost $135 billion in damage to Ukraine's infrastructure. About 1.4 million residential buildings were damaged in Ukraine, a third of which cannot be restored. And this figure is growing as the war continues. A huge economic crisis has broken out in Europe due to the huge expenditures on armed support of the Kyiv regime, the influx of 10 million Ukrainian refugees, as well as anti-Russian sanctions and symmetrical counter-sanctions from Russia. There is a frantic rise in prices and galloping inflation. Hundreds of thousands of enterprises have gone bankrupt. At the same time, about 50% of the Russian population lives below the poverty line. According to sociologists, on average, Russians work about 45 hours a week today. That is, most workers consistently all the time, at least 5 hours a week. At the same time, the share of those who received additional payment for these overtime hours has decreased from 31% to 24% of the number of workers. And prices are growing like a snowball. The annual inflation in Russian Federation is 8.53%. Food inflation for the same time reaches 30-40%. According to independent experts, Russia spent more than 100 billion on defense in 2023. As a result, the Kremlin had to abandon the planned increase in salaries for some categories of civil servants, despite inflation of 7.5%, far ahead of the central bank's target of 4%. In 2024, the government spent more than 14 trillion rubles on defense and law enforcement agencies. This is 38% of all budget expenditures. Tens of thousands of buildings in Donbas, Kursk, Bryansk, Belgorod regions and other regions of Russia have been destroyed. Part of the Kursk region has been captured by the enemy for the first time since 1933. The war is also hitting the US workers. As Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene stated, Washington's active involvement into the Ukrainian conflict on the side of the Kyiv regime leads to the weakening of the United States in the international arena. Washington's actions are depleting military resources, causing inflation in the United States, and damaging trade and economic ties with other countries. Dear Trump, despite the difference in our mentalities, culture, value system, as well as the geopolitical and economic interests of the ruling bourgeois classes of the Russian Federation and the West, it is much more better for our countries not to fight, not to waste nuclear warheads, but to be friends, trade with each other, and promote the strengthening of the universal environmental security. As a Bolshevik Leninist, I advocate an immediate end to the armed confrontation, the introduction of ceasefire under the supervision of international UN peaceworkers, and the beginning of peace negotiations. As for territorial disagreements, here the right of nation to self-determination, as approved by UN Charter, certainly has priority. As well as you know, the overwhelming majority of residents of Crimea, the Donetsk People's Republic, and the Lugansk People's Republics, more than 95%, voted to secede from Ukraine and reunite with Russia in democratic referendums held in accordance with international law. Dear Trump, unfortunately, armed conflict also leads to an environmental disaster. The environment has suffered enormously. Over 13,000 square kilometers of protected areas were in the war zone. Populations of endemic plant and animal species suffered significant losses. Migratory bird species were deprived of their usual routes and nesting sites, and the result of long-term biodiversity restoration projects were destroyed. According to the UN, over 700 hectares of land in the Donbass alone are an environmental disaster. But unfortunately, not only war can cause damage to nature, but also ill-considered human actions in peacetime. Dear Donald Trump, while people in Moscow were preparing to celebrate the New Year on December 27th, Moscow Mayor Mr. Sobyanin adopted Moscow government resolution number 3160, which transformed 146 Moscow specially protected natural areas into specially protected green areas. As a result, almost all bans on the construction and operation of infrastructure facilities in protected areas which were previously prohibited on these lands were lifted. Why? Protected natural areas are the natural complexes and objects with special environmental and scientific significance and which have been withdrawn from economic use by a state decision and for which a special protection regime has been established. Rare endangered species of animals and plants live there. The total area of 148 existing protected areas in Moscow is about 20,000 hectares. Unfortunately, law number 3160 removes the nature of Moscow from the federal law on protected areas, effectively allowing any economic activity in them. Now, on the former specially protected natural areas has become possible to build pipelines, highways and buildings. This actually means that on natural areas that were previously considered protected due to their unique natural characteristics, objects can be built that have a significant negative impact on the ecological situation in the city. Of course, this opens the way not only for the construction of some purely infrastructural facilities, but also for the mass development of unique natural areas with big buildings and supermarkets, which will inevitably lead to the degradation of Moscow ecosystems, a deterioration in the quality of life of citizens and an increase in the environmental burden on the capital. I would like to note that the transfer of the specially protected natural areas to the specially protected green areas exacerbates the harmful practice of cutting down and building up Moscow forests and parks, which started back in 2011. Thus, in Moscow, the total area of green spaces, excluding protected areas within the city limits in 2020 was 126,000 hectares. In 2021, 124,000 hectares. In 2024, only 91,000 hectares. Thus, from 2021 to 2022, the area of green spaces within the city limits was reduced by almost 7,000 hectares or 65 square kilometers. And from 2018 to 2021, the area of city parks and forests has decreased by a third. In total, 5,000 hectares of green spaces were destroyed in the capital during this time. It is widely known that the reduction of forests and various green spaces leads to the fact that the natural reduction of carbon dioxide levels is interrupted. It accumulates in the atmosphere, resulting in an increase in the greenhouse effect. This contributes to global warming and climate change, affecting the weather, and also leads to disasters such as floods, severe hurricanes and droughts, the extinction of many species of plants and animals, and an increase in human disease. Thus, the destruction of Moscow forests and parks that has been going on since the late 90s, sharply aggravated by Sobyanin's latest adventure, can lead to global catastrophe. Not only the nature of Moscow and Russia is in danger, but also the whole world. I would like to point out that Sobyanin, with his ill-considered degree, violated not only a dozen federal laws of Russian Federation and our constitution, but also a number of international norms, including those approved by the UN General Assembly and Security Council. These are Convention of the Conservation of European Wildlife and Natural Habitats, Convention of Environmental Safety, Convention of the Protection of the World Cultural and Natural Heritage, Convention on Biological Diversity, European Convention on the Conservation of Wild Flora, Fauna and Natural Habitats, and etc. Dear Donald Trump, we law-abiding citizens of the Russian Federation who love our country and nature have already written several complaints about the illegal transfer of the specially protected natural areas to the special protected green areas, to the prosecutor general officer, the constitutional court, the government, the Ministry of Nature, etc. And we would like to ask you, Donald, as the President of the United States, a country with very large political and economic influence in the world, to ask the Russian authorities, in particular your friend Vladimir Putin, to cancel the bill that liquidates Moscow specially protected natural territories. The forests of Moscow are the green lawns not only of the Russian capital, but of the entire planet.